My name is Carol Engelritz-Byrne, and I am the president of Global Minnesota. And this morning, we are so pleased to co-sponsor this program with Fredrikson and Byron, one of Global Minnesota's 51 corporate members. On today's program, Bridging the Gap in U.S.-China Negotiation and Communication Styles. As many of you know, every year Global Minnesota selects a focus country, and this year it is China. And so for the last 9 months, we have been examining various aspects of Chinese culture, from music to sports to politics to trade, and the important role that China plays in the world. And I think that what you'll find today's session, it couldn't be a more timely topic. Minnesota's relationship with China, it's deep and profound. The University of Minnesota was one of the first universities to start exchanges with China way back in 1914. And today we have over 10,000 Chinese alumni that went to the University of Minnesota. Also, in 2016, Minnesota exported $2.9 billion worth of goods to China and imported more than $11 billion. So, as you know, there's a lot at stake when it comes to U.S.-China relations. I also want to mention that this year, the culmination of our focus year will be our gala, which is going to be hosted on June 16th at the home of Muffy McMillan. So Muffy, I see you're in the audience. Thanks so much for generously hosting and over 400 people at your home that day. But what I want to say is that it is almost sold out. And so right now we still do have some patron and underwriter tickets. If you are at all interested, please contact us at Global Minnesota. And we've got some invitations out at the front as well as other information on Global Minnesota. But it really is going to be an amazing event with Chinese cuisine, entertainment, a live and a silent auction. And our guest of honor is going to be Chinese Consul General Hong Lei. And this week we just found out that along with Consul General Hong Lei from the Chinese consulate, he is also bringing 7 other Chinese diplomats with him. So this is really going to be a great opportunity to network and have a lot of fun as well. So for those of you who are Global Minnesota corporate members, I also want you to know that the Consul General and his colleagues are going to be in Minnesota for 5 days, and so we are setting up some private appointments with them. So if you are a corporate member and you are interested in that, please give us a call. And if you're not a corporate member, well, you should be a corporate member, and we would love to invite you to get more involved. But now let's get on to this really important program. And so I'd now like to introduce Bob Overly, who is a partner at Fredrikson and Byron, and he's going to serve as the moderator for today's program. Thanks.
Thanks, Carol. So welcome, everybody. I would like to say we're very grateful for our collaboration with Global Minnesota. And I'd like to commend Carol and her team for putting on an incredible year of China, a series of events, of which this is the last one, I think, right? So for those of you that I have not had the opportunity to meet, I'm Bob Oberles. I'm a partner at Fredrikson, and I chair the China practice. I was in China for 12 years in Beijing, Hong Kong, and Shanghai. Our office is in Shanghai. And our practice is primarily focused on helping U.S. companies navigate their joint ventures, strategic investments, and M&A abroad. Today, before we get started, I have a few housekeeping matters. For attorneys attending today's talk, you can apply for CLE credit by completing the green sheets in the back or in your folders. All comments today are off the record and not for attribution. We want this to be an open and free exchange of ideas. In terms of format for today, each speaker will talk for their topic about 15 minutes, and then we'll finish up with Q&A. You should have cards in your folder for if you have any questions, and we'll take those questions. We'll try to get through as many as we can. With that, let me turn to our speakers and introduce them to you. To my right is Tom Hansen. Tom is a former U.S. Foreign Service officer with the Department of State whose diplomatic postings included East Germany, France, Norway, the Soviet Union, Sweden, and the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. He currently is diplomat in residence at the Allsworth Institute for International Affairs at the U of M Duluth and serves as chair of the Minnesota Committee on Foreign Relations and as co-chair of the Minnesota-China Business Council. To Tom's right is Joan Brzezinski. Joan is executive director of the U of M's China Center and Confucius Institute. For more than 10 years, Joan worked in marketing and operations in China and the U.S., and later as a business consultant to companies working in China. In 1997, she joined the China Center, and in 2008, Joan helped to launch the newly established Confucius Institute and became its founding director. In 2012, Joan became the executive director of the China Center and currently oversees the China Center, Confucius Institute, and the University of Minnesota's China office in Beijing. So, quite a lot. To Joan's right is Larry Mahoney. Larry is CEO of Asia Direct Resources. In 1987, Larry started ADR, which is a consultancy group focused exclusively on supply chain management in Asia. ADR has since grown to include permanent sourcing operations in China and joint venture interests in multiple Chinese factories. To Larry's right is Raylin Lee. Raylin is an experienced attorney in our China practice group, licensed to practice in both the U.S. and China, focusing on business organization, governance, finance, securities, M&A, and the energy and life sciences sectors. Her unique qualification in the U.S. and Chinese law enables her to assist both U.S. businesses expanding into Chinese markets and Chinese businesses seeking representation in the U.S. For topics today, Tom will cover negotiations between American and Chinese counterparties from a government-to-government perspective. Joan will cover negotiation from the academic and cultural perspective. Larry will focus on principles of negotiation from the perspective of U.S. businesses trying to successfully manage their China sourcing and supply chain. And Raylin will focus on corporate culture differences, including internal workings of Chinese companies, from medium-sized to big private and state-owned conglomerates. I will cover negotiation from a U.S.-China deal-making perspective, whether through M&A, joint ventures, or other business transactions. So with all of that, I will turn it over to our first speaker, Joan Brzezinski.
Thank you. All right, good morning. I am Joan Brzezinski, and I've been coming in and out of China, tourism, work, study, other things, I guess, since 1982. It's been a long journey, but it's been a really interesting and excellent journey. And I'm going to talk to you a little today about Chinese culture and sort of what I've learned over the several years. One of the caveats to talking about culture is that it's a really fluid thing. It changes annually, daily, and it also is not a point-in-time kind of fixed concept. We're going to talk about a lot of structures, probably more towards traditional culture. But I think to keep in mind that it varies between generation, between business type, between organizational type, between region in China. So giving you a broad framework to think about it. I also think that there are a lot of China people here, experts in China. Can I see how many people have been to China before? So we are talking to some knowledgeable people. So one of the things I like to start out with when I talk to school groups and other people is that when we think about China, we often think about this East Coast region, the Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou area, the big buildings, the light rail, the high-speed rail, density of population, exciting restaurants and other things to do. But China is a very big place, and to remember topographically and geography and people and lifestyle, it's a very different place from shore to the desert, from north to south. So thinking about China in that way is some way a little bit different, especially when you're talking to people and you ask them where they're from. They're very proud to tell you, I'm from Chengdu, or I'm from some other region, and you might be interested in learning a little bit more about the wide range of things in China so you can communicate more closely with those people. just a background in demographics and economy. I think keeping in mind too that China and the U.S. Geographically are about the same size, but the density of population and the where people live, how they live is quite different. With 160 cities over 1 million people in China and only 10 cities over 1 million people in the U.S. So to keep that in mind too, and the urban population versus the rural population, but there's some dated statistics that say that 80% of the people live on 20% of the land in China, and that may be very still close to true. So we're going to talk about cultural comparisons, values and assumptions, how U.S. Communication style and cultural values differ from Chinese communication styles and cultural values. I'm going to dive deep into a couple of these, but some of them we'll just leave for later, another time. Americans are about individualism, and Chinese are about collectivism. And that's how identity is maintained. When you talk about individualism, Americans are encouraged to, we really just take care of our families, and we take care of our individual needs. We talk in I and we, or I, not we. And we have a lot of identity that's maintained through ourselves. Chinese are collectivists, and that means they communicate kind of collectively. They're always, as they talk to people, as they are engaging with people, they're always considering what their communication what effect it has on the people in the group and the people in the room. And they don't just speak boldly out just because they think it, but they try to think, if I say this, how will this affect the balance of communication between myself and everyone else here? Equality versus hierarchy. The U.S. believes in equality. People are equal. We don't necessarily presume any sort of hierarchy when we first meet people. There's no need to show undue deference or respect towards people. So in academia, in politics, there are titles and places in the hierarchy that we do afford additional respect, but it's more subtle. It's probably about how we talk to people or where we see one person at a table. In China, that structure is very pervasive across society, and you'll find it in meetings and in banquets and everywhere you go as to how the Chinese think in terms of the rank and in terms of the power that's shared throughout that hierarchy. Task versus relationship. Americans are task people. We go for the get it done, get it finished, clap our hands, slap our backs, we're done, yay, we finished it. Then we move on to the next task. In China, we're developing relationships, and we see that this relationship may help us afford to communicate and get something done, but we don't abandon that relationship once the deed is done. We continue to nurture it and continue to look for ways to leverage it as we continue to do our work and work with others. Direct versus indirect communication, how problems or conflicts are solved. Americans are typically direct communicators and Chinese are indirect communicators, and a lot of context with that, so I'll explain that later. Expressed versus restrained, how emotions are expressed. Americans typically express their emotions. We're angry, you can see it. When you're happy, you laugh. And you're very open with your emotions. Chinese are very reserved, and if they don't know you, it's going to be a very poker face kind of a meeting because you won't be able to see exactly what's going on internally with these people. So the recent outburst among our trade delegation to China might have showed a little bit less restraint than the Chinese are comfortable with. Informal versus formal, how relationships are supported, and we'll kind of move into that. So individualistic versus collective values. We talked about this a little bit. Self is relation. It's who am I in this group? Am I, what's my role here? And how do I play this role to the benefit of everybody around me? Individuals shouldn't be separated from obligations to each other. We have a role to play. We have an obligation to people, and we need to fulfill our side of it. And that requires reciprocity. So if I do what I'm supposed to do in this particular relationship, then you need to be doing what you're supposed to do. So Confucius said, let the emperor be an emperor, a father, a son. In other words, those relationships are defined, and how these people interact together is fairly well defined. So the implications of this kind of style of communication is that Chinese are unwilling to make a public statement in places where they're not familiar with everybody who's sitting at the table and what the group is thinking. If it's different from what they're thinking, personally, they might share that with you, but they may not afford any embarrassment to their senior people, their manager, as they're talking through a negotiation. And transactions are situated in relationships, not people. So we want to build those relationships. And relationships can dissolve as people move on to different organizations. They have some relationships they take with them, but some relationships are organizational. So those may remain with the organization. So if you need to get somebody's opinion, it's advised that you would probably meet with them privately. So some examples of collective versus individualist thinking. You can see the Beijing Olympics up here. It was a very collective, this kind of event. Everybody in motion together, harmonized. Zhang Yimou did a wonderful event at the beginning of the Olympics. And you can see our football players taking a knee, and that's a very individual expression of what they see wrong in society. And then on the right side, high level presidential meeting where everybody is seated at the table and in order. And another, this is probably not a great example of a meeting in the Oval Office, but it does show Kellyanne sitting on the couch, sort of in a very casual way, even though everybody else is standing and has suits on, and she seems oblivious to what the group is doing. So it's just kind of a fun little photo there. Egalitarian versus hierarchy. Confucian model determines role and behavior. We talked about that role that you play in society. So Confucius has a hierarchy of that. And respect comes along with that. We have to respect the system. We have to respect the people in their roles and continue to do that. It also affects introductions. When we're meeting people, we need to understand where they are in that hierarchy, how they fit into the role, and what kind of interaction is appropriate for me and that individual. So there's a formality to meetings and banquets that we're going to talk a little bit more about. The implications are for you to respect that. If you're, when we get delegation coming from China, we'll get their titles, we'll get their background, we'll know exactly who those people are. And they didn't just send that to me so I can make a better hotel reservation. They sent that to me so that I can determine who they should meet with at the university, who are the appropriate people to bring to these meetings so that they don't waste their time and I don't afford them any insult by not bringing the right people to meet with them. So learn a little bit about your Chinese partners, but do them a favor. If you're coming with a group of people or you bring your CEO or your governor or someone else to China, be sure that they have all that background information about who your delegation is, and so they can, again, make that same arrangement on their side. And consider who you're sending to do business. Don't send junior people to meet with senior people or to start a business deal if you're serious about getting a business deal done. So some examples of hierarchy that sort of come up in the press. The gentleman in the Starbucks on the left is the American ambassador to China, and he went into Starbucks and ordered his own coffee, which was shocking in China. He should have had an aide do that. Why is he standing in Starbucks? Why didn't he send his assistant? That kind of thing puzzles the Chinese, if anything. And then you can see the Chinese example of Xi Jinping and then his cabinet walking into a formal meeting with him at the lead and everybody behind him in rank order. And then another example is the Chinese officials standing outside in the rain and everybody else holding the umbrella over his head so that he doesn't get wet. And then we have Obama, which not only is he holding the wife's umbrella for her, but she's actually preceding him down the stairs of the airplane, which is a little out of sync. So just pictures and examples of things that would sort of bring kind of funny to the Chinese in general. So low versus high context communication. We are direct communication people and Chinese are high context communication. Basically, the slide on the right kind of says it all. We kind of go from point A to point B kind of directly, and the Chinese will wind around and talk a lot about other things. And they may try to infer or, imply a concept so that if they had to say it out loud, it might be kind of embarrassing, or it would be sticky, or it would probably hurt our relationship a little bit. But in this case, if I just sort of give you enough background, you'll figure it out, and we'll all be at the same place when we get to the final thing. So because, therefore, oftentimes we would say, well, the ship sank, therefore you didn't get your goods last week. Sorry about that. The Chinese might go into a more, well, the weather was rough and the sailors weren't able to control the ship, and there were some issues at sea, and well, you know. And so they might have to give you more background about it and try to get you to understand why they're not making efforts to complete the deal or to fulfill a promise that they made to you. Listening centered because of the fact that we are that direct communication style. It's my responsibility as a speaker to get here and to give you a point and to back it up with some evidence or some thoughts, and you expect that of me. You're not going to come in here and well, there's somebody who's going to challenge me later, but there's not a lot of people who are going to challenge me terribly on all of this. In China, it's the responsibility of the listener to be educated, to come in, to think about what we're going to be talking about. And if the person who's up front makes a spot analysis on something, then it's my responsibility to go back and find out the truth about whether or not what that speaker said was true or not. So listen to the speaker and wait for it to be made. This indirect method of communication, honestly, Americans just get bored. They tune out. And oftentimes, especially if you go to a formal speech or something and you're waiting and waiting and waiting, they probably won't make the actual point until the very end. So you want to be an active listener. You want to continue to remember to listen and not start thinking about other things. Try to think and hear behind the words. Oftentimes, if I have a lot of Chinese staff, and oftentimes they've come to me and they'll sit down and they'll give me a story, and I'll think, why did they tell me that? And then eventually I'll remember kind of why they told me that. And eventually I'll sort of figure out behind their words what it is they were trying to communicate without embarrassing anybody or saying anything unfortunate or unhappy. But it takes a little time, and it takes a little bit of effort sometimes after the conversation is done or after the negotiation is done to sort of reflect a little bit about maybe where they were going with some of that. Ambivalence always leaves room for negotiation and retreat. So if they don't say no, it's still in play. And oftentimes they will tell you yes instead of no to keep stuff in play. They may not be able to be the people who answer the question. They have to go up the chain or up the hierarchy to get a better answer for you. It could be they just don't want to ruin the relationship. They want to keep you happy. So if they tell you yes, you're happy. But in general, it's a strategy and it's a technique that we use to just sort of put a little distance between the two of us as we work it out. So know that yes doesn't always mean yes, but no should always mean no. Task versus relationship. I talked about this. We're task-oriented, and Chinese are very much relationship-oriented. And that sort of is under the umbrella of guanxi, and others will talk about guanxi here. But it's how we nurture friendships and relationships and with colleagues and others. It's how we build communication with these people that will last a good long time, and it will help us to negotiate and get tasks done as we go forward. Long-term relationships with people do matter, and planning, and that's why oftentimes, and Raylene is probably really good at contracts, but oftentimes contracts, especially even in the university setting, don't mean a lot. It's just it's a sort of a statement of our desire to have this relationship, and after that we figure the rest of it out. But planned meetings are usually to form relationships, and so we want to take time to spend time with people that are valuable to what we need to get done. 3 components of a Chinese relationship to consider are 面子, which is face, showing respect to each other for their status and who they are. 关系, which is a social networking that we talked about. And 人情, which is the exchange of favors. So face is really important. It's very hard. It's very important that you give face to people, and it's very important you don't cause them to lose face. Now, I work a lot with Chinese teachers, for instance, and I can be in a room with a bunch of people, and I can say, oh, thank you to so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so for the great work they did on this project and so-and-so. Well, if I forgot so-and-so, I have now an enemy here because I've just publicly shamed them. And it wasn't that I did it intentionally. I did just, it slipped my mind that that person was on the project or wasn't even in the room. It's really important to avoid those kinds of small slips that you might do that would cause somebody a little bit of face losing or shame. It's difficult to regain a relationship that has caused somebody to lose their face, and it might not be possible at all. So please just consider how your actions might work. Again, that collective thinking to shame somebody or to cause them some offense. Going to see, we'll talk about in a minute, wrenching the exchange of favors. Oftentimes, too, if favors are exchanged in advance. So if I think I need a relationship with you, or I think I'm going to need to be closer to you somehow and help you get to know me, I might give you a little bit of a favor. And so those favors are something that we have to be thinking about because oftentimes, too, there's an element of reciprocity to favors that will come forward later down the line. So, so this is kind of the Guanxi thing. In Chinese society, and this is a very dated sort of graphic, but I like it, is family, friends, schoolmates, neighbors, coworkers, business partners. And that's kind of the Chinese world right there. These are the people that are in your circle. And then also in this circle are these people. There are all these families, schoolmates, friends, business partners. In the outside circle, there's everyone else. So in your network, in your Guanxi network, are all these people in the middle. And I may not know your neighbor, my neighbor's schoolmate, but if I have a favor to ask that neighbor, like, I understand that your classmate's kid went to Harvard, my kid's going to Harvard, can I get some information about Harvard from you? That person will feel obligated to help me because they're in my social network. And so they want to, you want to use those connections to everybody to leverage things that you need and also expect to be leveraged. And then there's everybody else. I used to think when I was living in Beijing at the university and I would walk across campus, everybody was so nice to me. Oh my gosh, every morning the baker would say hello to me, the cook, all the people on the campus would say hello to me. And then I would get on a bus and people just elbow you to get out of the way and sit down. And it was because when I was on campus, I had the potential of either knowing them or know somebody that knows them. And so they were kind to me and I was in their network. But when I got on the bus in town, nobody knew me. It was just like, get out of my way, lady. So it was a little bit different. It was kind of different. So we're going to drill it down to meetings. So introductions. Chinese prefer to be introduced formally the first time you meet people. And this is a generational thing. If you meet a lot of young people, they may not feel the same way. And when we're in a large meeting like this, and I introduce somebody, they should stand up and be recognized and introduced. And greetings and addressing Chinese, often, a long time ago, I spent a lot of time on business cards. Hand the business card over, be sure it's got English on one side and Chinese on the other. And I think everybody here probably knows that, but I also think that now we just, we scan the WeChat, right? We don't do business cards so much. And I've found people in China tell me they don't even carry business cards anymore because all they want is my WeChat link. So things are evolving and changing, and social media is changing that for us. Chinese surnames on business cards and in places are sometimes first, sometimes not. Depends on what their style is. I've had people give their personal names first in Chinese, and usually if it's in characters, it's going to be in last name first and first name or given name second. But in the Pinyin translation, it's hard to know, so you just have to ask. Is this person, more modern or traveled overseas and wants their first name first, or if they're more traditional in a government position, maybe they don't do that. Titles are more appropriate than Mr. and Mrs., so if you know somebody's vice president or vice chancellor, you would certainly talk to them. If it's in person, one-to-one, you're talking to them, you would say chancellor or president. You wouldn't use the vice. But if his boss is standing right next to him, then you would say vice chancellor or vice president. So that kind of appropriate acknowledgement of hierarchy in dialogue. Please arrive on time. Begin with some small talk. Small talk includes where have you traveled? Do you like the weather? Do you like the food? Generally speaking. Principal members are seated and others followed by rank, as I noted when the Xi Jinping walked onto the stage. But that kind of rank order in filing into a meeting happens all the time. And if I'm at a Chinese meeting in a university setting, the president of the university will follow in by the vice president, by the dean, by the faculty, and they will come in order. Principal members are seated first, and then the others follow in rank, and we'll show you that in a minute. Dialogue is a structured series of speeches, not usually a free discussion the first time you're meeting with somebody, and especially if you're meeting with people in government agencies and institutions is more formal. So a typical meeting setting is like this. You can see Obama across the table from Hu Jintao. And the U.S. side is going to sit, I don't know if there's a thing here. The U.S. side is going to sit at the seats that face the door. So and that's medieval. That's to make sure that nobody comes in with daggers and stabs us. It's to show our friendship. But the U.S. side sits facing the door, and the Chinese sits with their backs to the door. And the center seat will go to the principal host or guest, and then their people will fill in right, left, like all the way down. And then on the other seating chart, that's a really formal meeting. You have, again, the U.S. side facing the door and the Chinese side back to the door. And behind them would the main host and main principal would be the interpreter. And then to the right, in the front row of those two rows of chairs, would be the delegation going down. And the people in the back row are probably not that important. In those kinds of meetings, especially the one on the right, it's not often that the people on the side of the room actually even speak, unless they're called on by the two people in the middle. So they don't actually raise their hand and jump up and say things. So it's more formal. Gift etiquette. Gifts are presented with at the end of the meeting. Be sure and present things and receive things with both hands as a sign of respect. Corporate gifts should be meaningful and should be nice for public display so they can show everybody that you've been there and that you have a relationship. Don't wrap with white or black. Use red and gold. And then don't expect it to be opened unless you request it. Though the more people who've been overseas and experienced American culture kind of get that they're supposed to open it, so they often do. It's really, again, a big flux of Chinese banquet etiquette is similar to meeting etiquette. There's a lot of food. Be sure to take your time and don't necessarily worry about eating everything. Alcohol, especially now, is for toasting etiquette primarily. I think maybe in the outer lands it still has a little bit more of fun taste to it. But in Beijing and Shanghai, especially under government budgets, you can see that this has been cut away or cut down quite a bit. But if there's alcohol on the table, you wait until the principal host has toasted everybody, and then you can drink. And then also be sure and toast your host. And no, there's no arguing over the bill. Usually the plate or some kind of sweet is last, fruit or sweet. And then this is typically how people are seated at a table during a banquet, if it's a more formal banquet with the interpreters. And then the second host can oftentimes also be seated at a second table, much like how we do it here. So that is my presentation. And whatever Grandma told you, just remember that and you'll do fine.
Thank you, Joan. So next, Tom.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks, Joan. I learned a lot from that. That was excellent. Well, I'm tasked with talking about the diplomatic relationship, and so I'll be discussing these issues at a state level, state to state. The Chinese state has certain ways of communicating with the outside world and also with its own population. And I'm going to try to describe some of the basic underlying principles that inform that. This is obviously an old civilization. It's changing somewhat under globalization, but a lot of the structures I'll be describing and mindsets still pertain. And as a diplomat, you learn to understand this as you're dealing with China. I think it trickles down, however, to the company and working level. What I'm going to describe right now you'll see it reflected through your contacts with Chinese as you engage with China. I'm going to structure my remarks in three parts. First, picking up on a good part of Joan's presentation there, the idea of relations. Guanxi is the tip of an iceberg of the Chinese view of the world. And it's very different from the Western view in some ways. And I'll try to flesh that out a little bit to give an indication of how important this is. Second, I want to discuss the modes of communication, the structures that the Chinese use to communicate both with the outside world and with their own population. And then finally, focus in on Xi Jinping, what he's embarked upon with China, and how this will possibly influence your activities in China. So first of all, Guanxi. One of the greatest experts on China, Joseph Needham, who wrote a book called Science and Civilization in China, which is still a standard classic, referred to the West as schizophrenic and suffering from a split personality in the way it approached the world. The Western world, he argued, saw things either in terms of mechanical materialism, focusing in on processes and objects, or in terms of a kind of theological spiritualism, which kind of separate the Platonic idea, separating all this out. And he emphasized this is exactly the path that Chinese philosophy did not take. It took a very different path based on relations among things. Whether it's a living body or the universe, you just need to understand the relationships going on within it. Now, the I Ching is all about that. In other words, you don't ask these larger spiritual questions, you look at the relations that are interacting. That is what modern science is about. In fact, the old Chinese view is closer to modern science today. And so this is a very, very, very deep way of looking at things in China. Underlying this interaction is the goal of harmony. Now, I cannot emphasize how much the term harmony is important in China. In diplomacy, it's all about harmonious relations. Xi Jinping is positing a harmonious society by 2049, the anniversary of the People's Republic of China. This interaction is interesting. Just one example of it. There's a philosopher named Michael Sandel from Harvard, who is a rock star in China. I cannot emphasize to you how important Michael Sandel is in China. He is a philosopher of justice. Not to get too wonky about this, but there's a fellow named John Rawls, who all students in America study today, theory of justice. The idea that justice is the key to a society, and it's based on individual choice. Sandel criticized Rawls, saying, no, it's about community. Community precedes justice. Now, the Chinese picked up on this idea. It's less individualistic. But when Sandel goes to China, he's criticized for having what they call thin community. The Chinese philosophers tell him we want thick community, in other words, based on harmony. You've got to have certain ritualized forms in your society or nothing works. So you see this, as I say, in diplomacy. And I think in personal relationships, oftentimes Chinese are looking for a harmonious interaction with you. In Confucian philosophy, harmony is a higher principle than justice. Now, this idea of a harmonious relationship is being used by China now as it proposes its principal diplomatic initiative today, which is the One Belt, One Road, the Belt and Road Initiative. They've engaged 70 countries in what is probably the greatest engineering project in human history across Eurasia. For companies, the one area where you'll have good Chinese cooperation is anything related to this project. Just as a tip for companies. This is something that is the centerpiece of what she is doing. So the United States is criticizing this. We don't like this at all, this One Belt, One Road. We don't want parallel institutions. We want certain standards. We are opposing it. And we are even bringing up, I've seen this in diplomatic discussions, the old Chinese concept of tiansha, which means all under heaven, right? In other words, in the old Chinese structure, China was at the center and interacted with the periphery, and that way there was a harmonious world all under heaven. So we are accusing China of trying to establish tiansha in the modern world with China at the center, which we see as against our interests. The Chinese response is, no, 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 no. That was the old China. This is in the interest of everyone. It's a win-win situation. Yes, it's harmonious, but it's not the old tiansha, all under heaven. And it's interesting how these old concepts are actually in the discussions nowadays. One place where you see this harmony idea too comes in Xi's approach to the U.S. Now, we had Graham Allison at the U yesterday from Harvard. He has written a book called Destined for War, Can America and China Escape the Thucydides Trap? Thucydides said that a rising power will always lead to war. And he cites 16 historical examples, 12 of which ended in war. It's a new book, but the Chinese have been onto this for quite a while. It's an example of communication, of China reaching into our Western tradition. Already in June 2013, at the first summit between Xi Jinping and Obama at the time, at the top of the Chinese agenda for discussion was Thucydides. And Xi Jinping said to Obama, look, we know history is against us. We know that our rise may alarm you, and it could end up in conflict. We have to keep this under control. Very interesting that there was a Chinese, already back in 2013. And in the process, she said, what we must strive for is a new type of great power relationship. This is in every U.S.-China communique ever since that meeting. It's an example of communicating, of trying to come to a common understanding of our situation. It was initiated by the Chinese. It's one thing to posit this. It's another thing, of course, to live up to it. But I think that's a heartening example of communication. And it leads me to my second point now, in addition to this idea of relations, harmony. This new type of great power relations, that's a very Chinese way of formulating things. They like slogans. They like pithy statements and comments in communicating with the outside world and with their own population. It goes back to an old Chinese tradition, rectification of names. The idea in old China is if you don't give things their proper name, chaos ensues. And therefore, we may find it ritualized, the way they do this. But you should be aware of what these sort of phrases and names are that are out and about in China, because I think you'll gain some credence with your counterparts if you know. So here are some examples. China, since the opening, since Mao, it's gone through three phases. Mao, standing up. Deng, becoming rich. And by the way, it's the 40th anniversary of the opening of China this December. It's been 40 years exactly. Standing up, getting rich, and with Xi, becoming strong. This is what Chinese people have in their minds. This is what they're reading in the paper, in the press. There are two goals, two centenary goals, 100-year anniversaries that everything's being structured around. 2021, the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party, where China is to be a moderately developed country. And then 2049, the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic, it will be a harmonious, developed society. This is what the Chinese people are being told, and a lot of what they're doing is being organized around these two centenary goals. As I say, this may seem kind of ritualized, structured, but this is the way you rectify names, if you will. China has 3 or 4 core interests. And in diplomacy, we hear about this all the time. The core interests are Taiwan, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and now South China Sea has been added. The implication is these are core interests and therefore no compromise. One of these goals, if you will, or modes of communicating is causing alarm in Washington. I think it was it was intended for the domestic population, but when Xi Jinping said by 2025, we want to be the world leader in tech and in artificial intelligence, and they're moving in that direction. This has sent off alarm bells in Washington. I was there in early May. This, if anything, is what is making the West feel challenged right now because China is far outspending us in AI and something like CRISPR technology of genetic engineering, they're outspending us 20-1. So once again, this phrase has really caught on in Washington in maybe not a good way. And then finally, Xi Jinping has told the Chinese population there are 3 challenges today. Number 1, debt. There's a huge debt bomb, as everyone knows, in China that at some point could cause a hard landing. Poverty, still up to 200 million people living in very dire poverty, and pollution. So China today is a mix of self-confidence, but also great trepidation or insecurity about these very challenges that Xi has named. And that leads me now to the policies under Xi Jinping. Because there definitely is a tightening up going on. We all feel it. For example, Joan talked about renching and the idea of mutual favors. Be very careful on that. That's part of the anti-corruption campaign. This kind of mutual favor is now being seen as corruption at certain levels in China. You have to be very careful on this. And the corruption crackdown is influencing companies, but also gets into the dealings of some foreign companies there. China is tightening up on its, shall we say, its sovereignty, its territorial sovereignty. When it comes to Taiwan, you have to be very, very careful, and Tibet. We've had recent examples here in the Twin Cities of this. Before, the Chinese were fairly loose about seeing China as a region. Now, under Xi, it's part of China. And if your company deviates from that, you're going to get a reaction. Medtronic, for example, has had problems. Some of their documents listed Tibet and Taiwan as independent countries. Most Western companies apologize if they're challenged on this, and they change. So you can say Taiwan, China. But the U.S. government is protesting against the Chinese, saying that they are trying to impose their views on U.S. citizens and on private companies, and that this should stop. You're caught in the middle on this. Beijing says if foreigners should respect our sovereignty when they're in our country, and this is a strict position. The other thing you're going to be feeling over there is China's move toward a social credit system. Now, they are, under Xi, they are using all elements of the new technology to perfect central planning. This is what they've announced, and they have, everyone's on board, Jack Ma, all the techies. There are very few libertarian techies, as we have in Silicon Valley in China. They're cooperating with the government. So facial recognition, DNA sampling, heavy monitoring of social media, with the goal of, by 2020, issuing all individuals a social credit score, which will then lead to punishments and rewards. It's very much like the old legalist system in China, where the idea was you need a strong leader and then a system of punishments and rewards because people are naturally bad. And so you have to have this. This has been a minor school in China, but it's you see elements of this in what she is doing. Foreigners will be caught up in this. You're going to be monitored when you're there. You will probably have a social credit profile if you spend any time in China now. So just be aware that, that this is happening. I think I've gone on a little too long here. I just wanted to highlight some of these differences. The key is that our two cultures understand each other, understand the worldviews and premises, and that the whole process remain peaceful. And I think as citizens interacting with China, we can contribute to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. That was fascinating and sobering. Larry?
Find the clicker.
Oh, here you go.
I'm Larry Mahoney. Good morning. My company is Asia Direct Resource. This is a company that I and my China partner started in China 30 years ago. So we have offices in China and around Asia. I'm going to talk about cultural nuance on communication from a business standpoint. Having operated in China for 30 years, we have a lot of experience negotiating a variety of things with a variety of countries. Oh, can't hear me?
To the mic.
Okay. Thank you. I need to tell you a little bit about how our company operates. We essentially move U.S. technology, transfer U.S. technology into the China manufacturing process. And in doing this, we have a lot of issues to work through with China factories and with the whole logistics process. Of course, historically, China has been the economic power. Take this out. China has been the economic power shaping the world political order. And there's always been a professed quest for world peace. Tom talked about the Thucydides trap, and China professes that we have to avoid this. We want to be peaceful together, and yet China does, again, see itself as the center of world order. When I first started traveling to China, I always operated out of Hong Kong. And I want to talk a little bit about history here and about the China's century of humiliation. Back in the mid-1800s, the Opium Wars, China ceded Hong Kong, Kowloon, and the new territories to China. And since then, China has been making great strides to rebuild itself. And the accomplishments that they've made in the last years are positively phenomenal. I'm going to talk about the cultural nuance, about the fact that it's steeped in Confucianism. I will repeat and emphasize a lot of what you've already heard from Joan. The Confucian philosophy puts a great value on virtue in ethics and moral goodness. We've already heard that we believe in Chinese will believe in society over the individual, the company over the individual, the group over the individual. And this can manifest itself. How does this square with what we all understand as China's thievery of intellectual property? The Chinese won't necessarily see that as thievery, because after all, the United States is the established nation. We are very successful, and we have an obligation. We have an obligation to share this technology with others. It's often seen that way. And I'm not asking you to subscribe to that, but you should be aware of it if you're thinking about doing business in China. And that's going to move me right into a little bit of guanxi. My China partner, my general manager in China, part of what we do, we find factories to fulfill our customers' needs. And in that process, we establish very serious guanxi with the factories. This relationship will almost essentially guarantee that intellectual property will not be stolen in that environment. That's the kind of relationships that we build with our factories. Face, we talked about a little bit, and you can't underestimate the importance of face. Joan talked quite a bit about this, the importance of learning how to give face to the people you're interacting with, making sure that you don't lose face, making sure that the person that you're interacting with doesn't lose face. When I started doing business in China, my first customer, lucky me, happened to be Mattel Toys. Now, this didn't happen with me specifically, but because of my relationship with Mattel, I was very, very much aware of a situation that happened. Mattel was very, very hard on, well, they're very hard on quality control standards, and they're very hard on price. I mean, after all, that's why they're moving all their operations to China, right? They want a lower price, and they want good quality. Price is a subject that any businessman can get tripped up on easily. In this specific situation, they pressed a factory they were working with so hard on price that he used inferior materials. Specifically, he used leaded paints on children's toys. And guess what? The Consumer Product Safety Commission discovered that when the product was imported to the United States, and thousands of parts were rejected. That factory lost its Mattel business. The factory manager lost his face and hanged himself in his factory. That may be an extreme example, but face is a big deal. And it's important to understand it. There was one time when I took a factory office of about 15 people, factory that I've been working with for years, took them to dinner, and the factory owner whispered to me, "We're not going to go to dinner in Hong Kong. It's too expensive. You can't afford that. We're going to an outlying area. We're going to go to Mongkok. That'll be much more affordable." Okay, that sounds good. Thank you very much. And we had a very nice dinner, and he brought me the bill for about $3,500. And I looked at him. I had an engineer that worked for me, but was part of this factory. I looked at him, and I think I must have gone pale. And my engineer came up to me and gave me an elbow. I said, "Don't worry, Larry. He just gave you a lot of face." Okay. Conflict is something you need to avoid. Whenever you have a conflict, you need to find a way to finesse around the issue, whatever the issue might be. Otherwise, conflict will inevitably result in somebody losing some face. So you just don't want to do that. The Chinese are big on orderliness, rules of relationships, guanxi. And guanxi is another concept that, simply stated, it's a really serious relationship, but it's so much more than that. One of the factories that I work with, we make a lot of paper goods. And paper mills is one of the industries in China that's coming under a lot of pressure because it's a very polluting process. So paper mills are having to put in new procedures, new equipment, and the prices are going up. Well, I've had to raise prices to my customer a couple times. Now my customers come to me and their profit margins have gone down. They haven't been able to raise their prices. And my customer came to me and said, "Okay, we want to introduce 6 new product lines this summer. But you have to guarantee me that you won't raise the price." Well, how can I do that when nobody has any idea about what's going to happen to the price of the basic goods, the paper? But I went to my general manager, David Lee, fine young man. He's about my age. We've worked together for 30 years, so we have strong guanxi between us. And I explained the situation to him, and he went to the factory and came back agreeing to hold the price for 12 months. So that means that the factory is willing to let their margins erode, and my company is going to have to be willing to let our margins erode if, in fact, the cost of paper does increase, which it most likely will. But that's the sort of thing that you can get if you have really good guanxi. We do a lot of work in plastic molding. If you have anything to do with plastic molding, you'll know that injection molds can be very expensive. In China, they are maybe a quarter of the cost of a US-made mold. but you still will pay that cost. Maybe it's, depending on the size of the mold, how much steel is being used. Maybe it's a $10,000 mold. Maybe it's a $40,000 mold. And you figure once you pay that money, that's your mold, right? You can't assume that. You can't assume that. Many factories, you pay that money, and it allows you to use the mold that they made for you. So you have to negotiate up front. Okay, if I give you this money, I want to own the mold. So if business changes for me and I need to move that mold, then I want to be able to do that. And I have one case that I have firsthand knowledge of where the customer did great due diligence, made it very clear about who owned the mold, and if he needed the mold to be moved, it could be moved. As it turned out, he wanted to move the mold, but he wanted to move the mold to another factory just down the street. So now the factory that originally made the mold was going to lose its face. So he never got his mold back. And again, these are the kinds of things that if you're going to do business in China, you need to understand some of these kinds of risks or these kinds of cultural nuances so you understand what risks you are or are not taking. As Joan said, everybody must win. The Chinese will believe that not every problem has a solution. And one of my favorite standard beliefs in China, and if you look at Hong Kong, I consider Hong Kong a great example of the patient accumulation of relative advantage, where Hong Kong was ceded to Great Britain in the mid-1800s, came back to China without anybody firing a shot. Shenzhen. Shenzhen is a city right across the border from Hong Kong. 30 years ago when I was in Shenzhen, it was a farming village, and the streets were crowded with people on bicycles and motor scooter. Now those are all designer shops, and the streets are crowded with BMWs, Lamborghini, Mercedes-Benz, and Buicks. Buick's a very hot car, very popular car in China. As, again, Joan said, the United States businessman tends to be very pragmatic, very results-oriented, very direct, very egocentric, very ready for conflict. I have worked for businessmen that love to have conflict. It's like a chess game. So who's going to win this battle? They love to do that. They love to find blame. Where China wants to solve a problem, and forget about blame, you just solve the problem. United States business tends to be very price-driven. I mentioned that earlier. And trust issues are very common. Because of some of these cultural nuances, again, not necessarily things that you like you don't want to think that your intellectual property may be at risk, but you need to understand that it may be. So the United States will often not trust the Chinese people that they're working with, but guess what? The Chinese people don't trust the U.S. businessmen that they're working with either. U.S. business can easily place orders and make promises and not fulfill those promises and cancel orders. That's just a picture I put in here to break the monotony. So we talk about Chinese culture, Confucianism, societal considerations, the group over the individual, the political climate with China on the rise right now. The Chinese people are full of confidence. And just as China's getting a black eye in the US in some respects, so does the United States get a black eye in China in some respects. My partner, David Lee, who, he and I are literally like brothers. But if I bring up a conversation about the South China Sea, he'll get very irate. Why are you floating your battleships through China waters? Those are China waters. Historically, they are China waters. and you're just causing trouble. So we move away from that topic. There are cultural imperatives working in China. Need to be willing to understand and compromise. Need to be always prepared to show respect. If there's one most important takeaway, it is respect. Not mistrust, but respect. Avoid conflict and blame. Understand the importance of face, and be polite. Once upon a time, I had a customer that had a really required delivery date on a project that was just starting, and when I pressed that delivery date, the response I got was, that could be difficult. So I looked at David and said, so what does that mean? Is he going to make the delivery date or not? And he said, no. That can be as close to no as you get. That could be difficult. The Chinese will usually consider no to be an impolite thing to say to a customer. And then just some pictures of some of the one of the joint venture factories that I work with. Look for the long term, the patient accumulation of relative advantage. Understand guanxi. Don't be unreasonable. Factory visits are a really good thing. The factory manager knows that you just flew in an airplane and spent a lot of money to come see their factory, and they respect that. So factory visits are always a good thing. That will help to build the guanxi. Of course, language skill is a plus. I do not speak Chinese, but I have a trusted China partner, and that goes a long ways. It's all about creative problem solving. That's it. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Larry. And Ray Lynn?
I'll go around that one.
Okay.
I think he left it up there.
Morning. Thank you for coming. I think all the speakers today are from the U.S. They learned Chinese culture by going to China, working in China, or living in China. I am the opposite. So I'm originally from China. I grew up under Chinese culture. I learned U.S. culture after I moved over here over 20 years ago. I think the previous speakers laid great groundwork about some of the differences between the two cultures. And I want to share with you a real example. I came to the US in 1994. I joined a firm in 1995. In 1997, I was admitted to the bar, Minnesota bar, as a foreign legal consultant. When the good news arrived, I happened to be in China, and Rich Weiner from the firm, he called me to tell me the good news. I think some of you may know Rich. He is from New York, very confident, very outgoing, very extroverted. So he was very excited on the phone and told me, hey, you are the first one and only one who are admitted to the bar that can advise US companies on Chinese law. I am, on the other hand, I was happy, but I was more reserved and tried to restrain my emotion. So Rich didn't hear me, jumping, laughing, or cheering. I think he was surprised and maybe a little bit disappointed. So he finally asked me, are you happy? After I talked to Rich on the phone, I probably had a big smile on my face. So my father asked me what happened. I told him. The first thing my father told me was, 喜怒不形于色, meaning you don't show your happiness or anger on your face. So obviously, I was too emotional. I showed too much emotion by my father's standard. So that's a real example of the differences between the two cultures. So today, I'm going to briefly cover 3 areas. The first one is, I think China is closing the gap between the two cultures with all the economic development. And the second area is, even so, there are still significant differences between the two cultures, especially, in terms of business negotiation. And thirdly, it also depends on who you deal with. So I'm going to briefly mention some differences between large state-owned enterprises and private companies. As I go along, I try to share some real examples. I think that will be more helpful. China is going to celebrate its 40th anniversary this year of the open door policy. So over the last 4 decades, China is becoming a world economy superpower. And also during the 40 years, foreign investors, they not only bring to China foreign investment, advanced technologies, they also bring to China Western culture, concept, management practices to China. So China is heavily influenced by that. And also with, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Chinese students studying overseas, when they return to China, they also bring back the Western lifestyle and concept to China. So I would say in China's today, the traditional Chinese culture and modern culture, they coexist. It's evolving. And I'm going to give you a couple examples of the evolving culture aspect. So everybody mentioned guanxi is extremely important in China, which I totally agree, and particularly under traditional culture. My older brother got his first job by guanxi about 40 years ago. So he got the best job he could ever got at that time without interview, period, 100% by guanxi. But today, things are changing. So guanxi is counterbalanced by professionalism, by your qualification credentials. So my son visited China early this year, and he got fascinated about China. So he decided to go to China to find employment opportunity. So through my guanxi, he got a telephone interview with a private company in Shanghai. The CEO of the Shanghai company graduated from Harvard Business School. So she was happy about the telephone interview, but because my son is not 100% fluent in Chinese and he grew up in the US, the CEO was only willing to offer him an internship with the expectation that, my son Tim would have got a employment based on his performance. So in today's China, guanxi, in my son's case, may no longer be the golden ticket. So may no longer be able to get you everywhere you want to be. So you still have to show your qualification credentials. The other example I want to share is modesty and confidence. Joan mentioned that as well. And the traditional saying is 谦虚使人进步，骄傲使人落后, meaning humility makes people progress, moving forward, but pride makes people fall behind. So when I was in school, when I was young, no matter how well I did, my father probably never said, good job, way to go. I don't even remember. He probably never said that to me. It's always, you need to improve 1, 2, 3, 4. So I remember when I came to the US, when I attended the first parent-teacher conference for my son, all the teachers told me, oh, Tim is doing very well, very well. Everybody told me that. So I was a little bit confused at the last. I couldn't help just to ask, what other areas Tim should work on? And then the teacher was surprised to hear that question. They thought, nothing, not really. So that's kind of the culture shock I experienced myself. And also in today's China, the younger generation, they tend to project them very confident. I think as we can see in China, a lot of commercial advertisement with "Yes, I do, yes, I can" slogan. So things are changing slowly. However, that leads to my second topic. There are still significant culture differences during business negotiation, pre-negotiation, during negotiation, and even after negotiation. Negotiation in Chinese is called 谈判. Direct translation is talk and make judgment. So when you meet your Chinese counterpart, the first impression is very important. So you do need to show respect, as Larry mentioned, be sincere and in good faith, and try to establish personal relationship, rapport, and trust. And that's the first step in order to move forward. And the parties normally just to enter into a transaction based on cooperative spirit. Legal agreements and regulations, they are important, but only after you establish a good relationship, you move to the next stage. So during negotiation, in the US, typically we prepare a very detailed issue list to be discussed during negotiation. Chinese people, on the other hand, they tend to focus on the general principle, the big picture. As I think Joanne mentioned, you just focus on the general principle with the details to be discussed later. And then also be very realistic on timing. Also depends on who you deal with, especially if you deal with state-owned enterprises and can take very, very long time. So adjust your schedule accordingly. And sometimes you even need to help your Chinese partner to say no because they're not good at saying no. So I have a state-owned company client, a big company in China. They have a US subsidiary. So the Chinese parent, the big boss, just told the US local manager to adopt the employee handbook, the Chinese version of the employee handbook. And then, the big boss said that's our principal policies, everybody should comply. So when I look at the employee handbook, it's just not working in the US because US employment law are so different than Chinese employment law. So I told the US local manager, this poor guy, he looked at me, he said, I cannot say no to my boss. So in that case, we have to be creative. I have to help this local manager to say no to his boss. So finally, we were able to create a US version of employee handbook without offending the boss in China. I think some of you may have experienced reopened negotiation after closing a transaction, which is very common in China because they enter into the relationship based on trust, and they focus on the general principles, not the details. So it's very common sometimes you have to reopen the negotiation after execution of the agreement. So recently, I worked on a big acquisition, actually. A Chinese company acquired a US company for over $100 million. And we signed agreement early this year. But 3 months later, they revisit the financial statements and numbers. They figured out they offered too much. So now they're going back to the US company to renegotiate the purchase price. And then the US company is willing to go along because even if the Chinese the buyer, they drop the price is still higher than otherwise another US company would offer. Lastly, I want to mention that trust and 关系 are ongoing. So they do not end at the closing of the transaction or at the signing of the agreement. I have worse stories when trust is broken. but because of timing, we can save that for another day. With all that said, I think that leads to my last area. It really depends on who you deal with. So I'm going to address some of the differences between large state-owned companies and private companies. So for state-owned enterprises, one of their top priorities is to provide stability, harmony, and employment opportunity in the local community. So profit making might be secondary for state-owned companies. And the employee turnover rate is much lower than private companies. The decision making takes very, very long time. I have a couple state-owned enterprises. Every single decision will take weeks or months to arrive. So layers of decision making. And then also the other thing is, in the big state-owned enterprises, nobody wants to make the decision because they all want to avoid personal responsibility and liabilities. So if you don't make any decision, nothing wrong is going to happen. Worst case, the company doesn't make money, but the Chinese government has a deep pocket. But if you make any decision, something is wrong, you may get demoted or even fired. So in order to avoid responsibilities, people tend to avoid making decisions. For private companies, on the other hand, it's more like, U.S. private companies. They are more profit-driven, much quicker in making decisions. Sometimes they make impulsive decisions. Also do a lot of things based on short notice. 6 years ago, when I was in the middle of remodeling my basement, I received a call Thursday night from a Chinese company in Beijing. And they told me to go to Beijing on Friday, the next day, to negotiate a business transaction over the weekend. Even though they didn't say that directly, they indirectly told me if I don't go, I probably get fired. So I packed Thursday evening, got my ticket Friday morning, and jumped on a plane Friday afternoon. Also, the power structure within a private company is somehow familiar with the traditional Confucian family structure, where the big boss is the father within the family, and the mid-level managers are children, sons and daughters. The big boss can be very, very harsh. We talked about face value, but I personally evidenced, the big boss just publicly criticize middle-level managers, and that was shocking to me. But on the other hand, the big boss, the father in the family, also provide protections to mid-level managers when it comes to promotion or bonus. Working, sorry. With that, I think, just in closing, in today's China, I think traditional Chinese culture and modern Western culture, they coexist. It's a mixture. So, but the traditional Chinese culture still prevails. It's still a great moral code. And of course, there's no one-size-fits-all solution. There's no fixed formula for every single situation. And so just consider who you deal with, consider the location, the time, the situation, and also the context. So what I would recommend is to build a diversified culture and diversified team with your organization. And then also foster, nurture a long-term relationship with Chinese counterparts. And then when issues arrive, try to use good faith, respect your Chinese partner, and find solutions that can benefit both parties. That's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Raylyn. I will round out the discussion with a discussion on negotiation of deals, U.S.-China deals, and I'm going to try to leave some time for Q&A, so I will try to make this abbreviated. I also have prepared my remarks based on a U.S. company audience, which is pretty much 98% of folks in the room. If I was doing this in Shanghai with Chinese companies, I would be emphasizing different points, so keep that in mind. And I thought it would be helpful just to share a kind of a top 10 list of do's and don'ts for when you're doing a deal with a Chinese business. So I think the first one is framing the deal, framing your investment. I think it's really important to think about how your investment, your product fits within China's policy framework. How does it help China? And to the extent that you can look at it and find that actually it's very consistent with China's current policies and what they're focused on, the more you find that alignment, the more likely your deal is going to be successful in China. And I think, as many of us know, Beijing and the government is involved in every aspect of Chinese society. So it's kind of, may not be the top question, but I think it is one of the top questions. And if you find that your product is, let's say, involving a dirty manufacturing process of a cheap widget, that might have worked 10 years ago, doesn't work anymore, and that's not what China wants. So I think that's a really important piece. And I think when you look at your deal through this lens, it can also help filter out other aspects of the interactions with your Chinese party. For instance, when you look at your product, let's say you have a pacemaker and you say, this is a pacemaker that China wants, it needs, they need something like this at a decent cost. And you have a Chinese partner who is saying, we're going to represent you for China, we're your perfect partner, we'll bring this to China, we'll open up China for you. Well, I think you have to look at that very carefully and assess, is this the right partner? Should I use multiple partners? China's a very big country. Should we look at submarkets? And should I have a partner for Beijing and a partner for Guangzhou and a partner for Shanghai? Many Western companies, they're busy with their U.S. business, they're busy with their European business, and it kind of comes as a relief, the idea that you're going to have one partner for China, they're going to cover the whole thing, and you're going to just entrust them to really develop the market for you. And sometimes that works very well, but other times it's a mistake. And that kind of segues into my second point, which is when you're going to China, consider an open marriage. And by open marriage, I mean that metaphorically, of course. Look for multiple dance partners. I think 100% of the deals that I do, the Chinese party will come to the table and say, we must be exclusive for China. We are the best partner for you, and we need exclusivity. And I think many Western companies concede that point very early, and I think they should really consider that, whether or not they should start the negotiation with the understanding that they're going to be talking to multiple parties and it won't be exclusive. And again, coming back to sort of what's in the interest for China, we want to find the best partner today and tomorrow, and we need that flexibility to work with who we think is the best fit. I think another point I would say is very important. We've talked a lot about hierarchy, and in the West, we are often kind of an egalitarian, more egalitarian format where your CEO you might even call by his first name, your teachers you call by the first name. China, that's not done. And in China, the hierarchy is dominant and very important. And so when you're dealing with the Chinese counterparty, they look at the top of your organization as the key person, let's say your CEO, as the key person that they need to get alignment with. And so I think the tip is really to protect, right at the very beginning of engagement, to really protect your king or queen, your CEO. You need to make sure that they are reined in. That they don't go and promise all sorts of things and give the other party their cell phone and call me anytime the project is not going well, because that can be manipulated, and the Chinese party can use that to really drive the deal. And so it's very important from the very beginning to get alignment with your full deal team, including the top leadership, even if they're not going to be very involved, particularly actually if they're not going to be very involved, because often they don't have a sense of the real detail of the deal, and yet they're getting a call from kind of their counterpart saying, hey, why isn't this going faster, and why can't you make these concessions, and I think we're being very reasonable, all those kinds of things. It's a really important element, and of course, you have to bring in the big dogs at certain points. They have to attend certain meetings, but often it's you bring them in and they make an appearance and then you get them off stage. So it's a really important element to keep in mind. I would also say, I mean, this sounds somewhat fundamental, but it's really important when you're dealing with Chinese companies to really bring your A game. Chinese businesses have a reputation for being very good negotiators, and in the 20 years I've been doing this, I would say this is almost always true. And there's a lot of theories for why this is. Some would say it's a bargaining culture. No matter where you go at every element in society, people are negotiating. Everything is negotiable. You go to the market, you're buying bananas, that's negotiable. And so when you grow up in this culture, you get good at it. You're used to it. You're comfortable with it. And there's lots of theories, but what I've observed is that generally your typical Chinese company compared to your typical U.S. company, the Chinese company, are very good negotiators. And so you need to bring your A team, you need to bring your A game to the match. And I think the other piece of that is that lots of corporate development people, they do deals all around the world, they do deals in the United States, they might be very experienced, but to the extent they haven't done a lot of deals in China, they need to think about it carefully. These deals are harder, and they need to really mobilize all of their talent to get the deal done right. I think the kind of a corollary to that would be to negotiate hard and smart. There's an element, all of these things that we talked about today, I think some U.S. companies can be overly accommodating and in trying to not offend and to show face, they often leave a lot of value on the table. And so it's very important to make sure that you're a strong and worthy partner and that you are pushing back on the terms that are meaningful to you, and that pushback garners respect. It's kind of like what we were saying in the market. If I go and I buy, bananas and I don't bargain, well, the merchant's not really respecting me for that. They're expecting some give and take. And so it's okay to be challenging on every single point. And I think for price, for instance, a lot of American companies will come and they'll say, after a round of negotiation, they'll say, this is our final offer. And they mean it. They're not going to move at all. And that's typically a mistake. You should always leave a little bit of cushion there in the price. Another tip I would say is really important to do your homework. One of the speakers mentioned this already. This kind of goes along with being a good partner. And I think for other deals, a little homework always goes a long way. I think for China deals, I would always recommend doing a lot of homework. Really understand the market, really understand the players, really understand the regulatory environment that you're dealing with and how that's going to affect the deal. Again, this kind of comes back to the partner. I think the partner will really appreciate it and respect it if you put that effort in. Another tip I would say is see negotiation as the opportunity that it is. For American companies, I think negotiations are approached largely as a necessary evil to get a deal done. It's kind of an unfortunate tit for tat that you have to go through, but we'll get through it and we'll get a signed deal. I think Chinese companies approach it a little differently. It's much more about setting the term for a very long-term relationship. And so there's always a process of information gathering, testing, trying to see, is this the right partner for me? And I think that for American companies, really when you're going to China or they're coming to the U.S. and you're trying to do a deal together, you really need to look at it as an opportunity to build a very long-term relationship and to really expand your guanxi, expand your social capital in China, and really investigate who are the best contacts in China for what you're trying to do. Another item is to beware of the non-binding term sheet. I think a lot of folks come to China and they are they're going in, they have a couple meetings, and then they're told that the local party would like to sign a memorandum of understanding. And they're saying, well, partly, don't worry what it says. We just need to get something written so that everybody feels like something was accomplished. And that can be a big mistake, because these general high-level principles are actually very important to the Chinese side. In fact, sometimes they are more important than all of the detail. And this is quite a significant difference between kind of Western companies and Chinese companies. The Western company would say, look, we have an LOI, it's non-binding, who cares? We're going to get it all right in the definitives. Again, that's a big mistake, because this is a very important opportunity to get the principles right, and this is going to flow through the long term, and so you don't want to take those lightly. I think another point is, when you're doing these deals, is you need to really prepare for a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's kind of like home improvements. It's always going to cost twice as much and take twice as long. And I think for the China deals, it's going to take 3 times as long as you might think, and a lot more expensive. I think being patient may be your greatest asset. And it's also something that American companies are notorious for not having a lot of. Americans, they want to get a deal done. They show up and they're like, all right, let's get this done. And that's often a recipe for a bad deal. And so it's really important that you also convey the impression that you have all the time in the world. You're there to build a relationship. You're there to really investigate the partner and to really develop that trust. And you'll take all the time that it needs to get the right deal. Last do, I would say, is it's really important to model cooperative Confucian tactics and not adversarial tactics. So I think, and what I mean by this is that, Confucius, if you're thinking about it from like a Confucian way, is all about cooperation, and this is a kind of a key part of the Confucian thought. And versus, let's say, the art of war. And so if you have somebody on your corporate dev team coming up and saying, hey, I just read Art of War, and we're going to make a sound in the west and attack in the east, and we're going to hide a dagger behind a smile and stuff. You just give them a pat and A for effort, but don't employ those tactics. Although I think some of them are useful to understand, so you can recognize them. And if you have a partner who you think is employing these adversarial tactics, it's important to confront them on that and challenge them and say, that's not what we want. We want a cooperative orientation for this long-term cooperation. Okay, a few don'ts, again, for kind of U.S. businesses. I think one is don't overshare, and it's okay to be vague. I think Western companies are trained to be clear and direct, and I would say often American companies can engage in a monologue, and they just kind of go on, sharing all this information, and they think it's sort of part of the building of the relationship. And often they're providing way too much information, and it will be used against them. It's just not, and it's not consistent with how the local party is going to share their information. So it's important to be very disciplined in terms of the amount of information that you're sharing, particularly very early on in the relationship where they're testing you and you're testing them. Similar, kind of a corollary to what I said about bringing your A game, I would say it's really important to don't let down your guard, don't be sloppy. It kind of goes along with being a good partner. You might think, okay, I'm making this trip over to Beijing, and I show up, and we have a nice long negotiation. I did a really good job, and now we go to the banquet, and now I can just relax, and we can have some drinks, and I would say, that can be a mistake. The Chinese word for negotiation is tanpan, which means essentially judge, and you're always being talk and judge, and you're always being judged, and they are sizing you up as a partner, as a long-term partner, and so you want to make sure you're always representing yourself well in that regard. And then likewise, don't think you're Superman or Superwoman. A lot of these trips that involve travel overseas, it's usually not a very good idea to show up on a Sunday night and for a Monday meeting and then have all day and afternoon and then dinner and try to get this deal done in 3 days, because the jet lag is going to really have a big impact. And so, we think about all the banquet, and this is part of the tradition, and you need to go to the dinner, and if you don't go to the dinner, you're going to cause offense. And I would say, don't worry about that. I think it's really important to make sure that you can always be at your best at all of these meetings. And so you need to carefully manage that schedule when you make these trips. Don't just think, hey, no, I've done this, I can do this, I can work all night. It's not, you're not going to get points, and it can really harm the relationship too, because I've been in lots of meetings where the afternoon comes and the American side, they're all jet lagged, and they start falling asleep at the negotiating table. And I'm like, no, this is, and so it'd be much better to just say, we're going to have lunch, and then the rest of the day is off, and we'll see you again bright and early the next day. And, so it's a message that you might not hear often, but I think for me, it's really much more important to kind of protect your sleep. Sleep is paramount, and it kind of goes along of really making sure the whole time that they interact with you, you're impressive and you're really a good partner for them on that front. I would also say, don't underestimate the importance of contracts. You often hear, particularly if a contract is governed by PRC law, that, oh, the contract's not worth the paper it's written on, and it's totally meaningless, and the local party is, if it doesn't work for them tomorrow, they're just going to disregard it. And there's a little bit of truth to that, but it's, I think a better formulation is that the contract terms are fluid. And what you really want to think about, I mean, we think about it in the West as like, okay, this is my contract, and the four corners of this contract say this, so you must follow that. And that's not a very good formulation. You really should think of it as, today, this is the best deal that you struck with these parties, and you thought this was a good structure, but tomorrow it might change. And you, as a good partner, you always have to be sensitive to how that relationship is changing, and does this still make sense for them? And making sure that you're moving to make sure that it makes sense today, tomorrow, and the next day. But that said, the contract terms that you sign are still very important, and the local partners will take them seriously. They will certainly use them against you. So it's very important to take all of that more seriously than sometimes folks do, at least in the China context. Another tip I would say is, don't be a mooch. And what I mean by that, it kind of goes along with the gift-giving culture. A lot of companies, they go over to China. Chinese companies are very gracious, very good hosts. And so you often will go over and they've arranged everything for you. They've got hotel rooms, they got translators, they got cars, they have gifts. And I would say a lot of American companies say, okay, well, that's not really our custom. Thank you, and that's great. And they might give them something, but it's not really commensurate. So I think it's very important that you, as the American company, you're paying close attention to all of the things that the local partner is doing for you, and you make sure that you reciprocate that, and you keep that balance sheet even, and maybe, exceed it. And so, when they come to your headquarters, you don't just do it the way that you normally do it. You kind of go overboard to try to make sure, one, you reciprocate for everything that they've done for you, and then you're a little bit ahead. I think another item that I think Larry and others talked about is how you don't say no. This is sometimes hard. A lot of American companies, if they can't do something, they want to be upfront. They don't want to lead the local partner on, and they say, we can't do that. No, we're not going to do that. And again, that circuitous thing that image that Joan had, it's important to, you can say no in a lot of different ways. You don't have to be so direct, and sometimes it does cause offense, and so that's something to think about. I guess in the interest of time, I'll wrap up here, but I think the last point was just that negotiations are really never final. And so, as I said before, a lot of American companies, you're negotiating, you get to the point, you sign a contract, we're done. I would say, again, that's not the right way to think about it. Negotiations are really never final. You're always engaging in that discussion, always trying to find the right formulation for the partnership. So with that, we can turn to Q&A, and I think if you had any questions, someone can come around and take them. And I'm going to start us off. Okay, great. I'm going to start with a question for Tom. And maybe, Tom, I think, based on your 25 years in the Foreign Service, maybe you could speculate for a minute on what it would be like in the USTR these days, trying to negotiate trade issues with China, given the current composition of the cabinet.
That's an easy one. Well, I think that the problem right now for the Chinese in dealing with us and also for answering a question like that is there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty in the U.S. And it's not just within this administration. I think the Chinese see the U.S. going back and forth, really between different outlooks toward them. We've gone from the responsible stakeholder phase, Bob Zoellick's favorite phrase, where we engage China, make them part of the world economy, and they will change and become like us. And of course, that was an unrealistic expectation to begin with. From 2008, with Obama's pivot, the idea was, oops, wait a minute, they're not going to change. In fact, time may be on China's side now. Whether it was the financial crisis that affected us or what, there was a major shift in our view, I think, 2008 and after. And that led to the pivot, which is called rebalancing, but still. And ever since, China is convinced we are out to blunt their rise. I think that the common view in China now is that in many different ways, the U.S. has decided that China's rise is not necessarily in our interest. And come down to the USTR, in this administration, we're into a third phase of Death by China, the famous book by Peter Navarro, who's one of the main advisors. The idea that China's rise is affecting our domestic economy in negative ways. And, our national security documents say it was a mistake to integrate China into the world economy. It says that straight out, that we've been on a fool's errand. Now, so then the question is, what does this mean for our trade policy? I already said we're opposing the One Belt, One Road, which is Xi's number one foreign policy. It's even in the constitution now of China. Most of our allies are going along with this massive project. We are standing aloof. The strategic tariffs are something now, once again, we're going back and forth. ZTE collapses. Now we're going to save ZTE. I mean, the overarching feeling is one of uncertainty. But beneath it, I'm afraid that China now really believes the United States feels challenged enough that we are going to try to find ways to stem their rise. So where this goes from here, I don't know. We're talking about tariffs. We're talking about limits on foreign direct investment. And we're also talking about limiting Chinese access to tech. That's going to mean intellectual property, but it could also mean visas for students studying tech fields in the U.S. So where this goes, I don't know. I mean, it's up to Donald Trump, but I think the Chinese are looking at this, and within a great amount of uncertainty and backing and forthing in the U.S., they are seeing a power that is beginning to react against their rise.
Thank you, Tom. I think this is a question for Joan and Larry, but what are some techniques that someone can use once face is lost due to miscommunication?
Thanks, Joan. Once
Maybe
face
Ray
is-
Lynn, you can chime in as well.
Once face is lost just due to miscommunication, well, you have to talk it through. You have to understand why. First of all, who lost the face? Did I lose face, or did my China partner lose face? Did I insult him? If that's the case, that's a difficult repair work. It's not irreparable, but it's difficult, and it would take some effort. But it comes back down to that being very respectful. Maybe that's the China trip. You need to get over there and fix up that situation.
Okay,
Yeah, I agree. I think that an apology is due, and probably certainly more of a public apology in terms of
how that person lost face, where they lost face, with whom, and if you can repair that at all, acknowledging your mistake and taking some responsibility for causing that, it will do some good, but you may not be able to repair it.
I'll just make some quick comments. I think the face value also, does it work?
Screen.
Okay, depends on the circumstances. I think Chinese people internally, they talk very directly. As I mentioned, the big boss can publicly criticize lower level employees. In that circumstance, employees lose face, but they don't care as much. But in terms of Western and Chinese people communication, losing face, that's way bigger deal. So if you cause them lose face, that's way bigger deal. And also depends on how you make them lose face. And I agree with Joan. You should save that person's face and how you made him lose face. If you said something in front of other people, it's public apology. If you say something to save his face in front of those people, that's a good approach.
Here's another question, I think, for Joan, and Tom touched on this a little bit, but given the cultural exchange, have you seen any impact on students or academics being able to get visas? Have you seen any impact in terms of the trade issues and?
There's a lot going on in Washington right now in terms of immigration and visas. I would say, with regard to China, we've seen a few people not get visas to come to the U.S., and I'm not sure exactly that I know the particular situation with each of those individuals. People seem to be doing just fine, especially in cases of business visas or short-term visits for academics. Students are still getting visas to come. But there's a daily kind of up and down as to what's going on in terms of how statements about immigration policy affect visa and application review and things of that nature. So I would say at this point, we're not seeing a lot of downturn in terms of the visas. I think a lot of the negative immigration talk, and certainly a lot of the China talk, will impact student willingness and interest in coming to the United States. We haven't seen that turnaround yet, but it's probably going to happen, where fewer students will consider the United States as their destination. They may go to Canada or Europe or Australia. So it's a day-by-day situation. We're kind of just watching it at this moment, but nothing drastic has happened.
So this is a question, I think, for Ray Lynn and Larry. What suggestions do you have for protecting IP and trade secrets shared with Chinese vendors? Is the use of an NDA effective? What are the best practices in this area? Other than knowing somebody for 30 years.
Can you read that again, please?
Sure. What suggestions do you have for protecting IP and trade secrets shared with Chinese vendors? Is the use of an NDA effective?
Yes, I do use NDAs routinely. And certainly the relationship you have and the understanding you have, if you make it clear, gee, this is my intellectual property, and you can't share it with anybody, and they'll sign the NDA. And if it's an honorable factory that you're working with, that will protect you. So that is a good thing to do, and it can be effective. But if somehow you chose a factory that's not so honorable, that can be a risk. And I think that's one of the important things, is that there is a risk associated with intellectual property. I mean, we see that almost routinely. We see a lot of it. Maybe not routinely, but we see a lot of that happening. And people need to understand that there is some risk there, and be careful how you manage that risk, how you guard it. An NDA can be very effective.
I think my recommendation, the first recommendation is register your intellectual property in China. So if you file your registration in China, you have a resource, you have a recourse. If you don't do it, you are not protected. So I can't emphasize the importance of register your IP in China. NDA, of course, is better than nothing, but just the IP in China, I think, is more of an enforcement issue than the IP legal laws and regulations. And that's one of the top priorities I think the Trump administration is negotiating with China. And the U.S.-China Business Council, they do surveys every single year. I think maybe 10 years ago, intellectual property was ranked #1 concern for U.S. business doing business in China. I think now it's dropped to 6 or 7. It's improving, but there are a lot of room to work on for the Chinese side.
So I think we might just have one more question, and this one is for Tom. Can you speak to why the U.S. is opposed to One Belt, One Road, and why the U.S. does not focus on how the U.S. can support and capitalize on China's rise to power?
That's a very good question. We had a fairly high-level person from the Commerce Department out here some months ago for a program on sanctions against Russia. And in private conversation, he asked exactly the same question. I mean, I think the U.S. Commerce Department officials would like to be able to advise our companies on this. They see the opportunities. And companies like Caterpillar are making a lot of money on the new Silk Road. But politically in Washington, this is seen as a challenge to us. In 1945, the basic institutions that framed the world economy were established under our influence. There's a real reticence to have what they call parallel or competing institutions. And the New Silk Road has a number of those, something the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, for example, set up by the Chinese. We are saying, wait a minute, you got the World Bank, you've got IMF, other institutions. Why do we need these new institutions? And the idea being that they won't be as high quality, they won't protect intellectual property, they'll be on China's terms. This is going to be in my view, a long road for everyone concerned. The U.S. At some point will have to wake up to the fact that it's not 1945, that this is a much more multipolar, much more complex economy. By purchasing power parity terms, China's economy is already larger than ours. The one reason that China is offering parallel institutions is because we've kept them from having more influence in the existing ones. I'll just tell one anecdote to close here. When China announced the Silk Road and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, we told all of our allies, stay away, do not get involved, use the IMF and use the World Bank. And David Cameron and the British stood up and said, we want to be founding members of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And with that, all of our allies tumbled on board, with the exception of Japan. And Cameron was asked, why did you do this to the Americans, basically? And he said, well, it's very simple. Several years ago at the IMF and World Bank, we voted to expand the voting rights of China, India, and Brazil to reflect their status in the world today. That has been blocked in the U.S. Senate for the last 3 years. We're not going to wait around for American dysfunction anymore. That was David Cameron saying that. So yes, in my view, we should be getting out ahead of these. There are ways we can help to frame these in our own interest. But if anything, and this reflects what I've been saying all along here, we're going the other way. We are seeing China now as a challenge. And for the moment, at least, we are staying aloof and even trying to thwart some of these things. And I think, personally, it's against our economic interest.
Great. Well, thank you. That concludes our program. Thanks for being with us today.